basically, this is all about due diligence on tactical trading strategies. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to add a slight COVID bias to this, because obviously being in lockdown or some sort of isolation or offices being restricted access makes things like due diligence a little bit more difficult. I mean, you're not necessarily going to go in and sit down face-to-face with managers for probably significantly long time in the scheme of things. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that piece of the due diligence that, bearing in mind we've nearly 3 months of this already, and what we've been doing to kind of get comfortable in DD. So I will talk about tactical trading DD, but I will have this COVID, I'd like to have this COVID angle to it. So, keeping in mind the sort of the need to understand investment thesis and strategy, trade ideas, and the origination and trade execution and trade allocation, those concepts, if you like, when we look at tactical trading, we've talked about this before. And we understand how this sort of translates in the world of tactical trading, if you like. But how do we think this translates, or how these questions translate in the COVID world we live in? I mean, so for instance, is it any different to pre-COVID-19, or is it are there more things we need to think about that we weren't necessarily looking at specifically when it comes to trading due diligence? I mean, I have some thoughts on that, but I'll hand it over to you, Mike, to get your perspective, and then to Roger as well.
Well, I mean, what I basically would say is that I think, the COVID-19 is just, it's another exogenous variable that impacts markets, market operation, gives us a change of defining, the new market normal as a market changes its character through time. So I guess for me, I don't view currently pre-COVID and post-COVID relative to the operational elements of a business. However, what I do think is absolutely critical, and that is now when anyone goes and is looking at due diligence or reviewing a manager or a strategy, before January 2020, we had a new important reference point, and that was, how did you do in February 19? Because that became a new kind of a qualifier. Were you alive at the end of February 19? Did you do what you were going to do? Did you perform according to expectations, et cetera, et cetera? Now, on the tails of that, and we can talk about Q1, but it really is March 2020, now has become a new defining point as well. And and I'm going to finish this up very quickly, Carl. And so from my perspective, excluding the performance dynamics, I think anything that was happening to a manager, an established manager, an emerging manager, et cetera, during March 20, they should have come out of it. I mean, they should have had DR scenarios. They should have had, their trading rules and operational rules in place so that they were able to survive it. The exogenous variables in this situation of March 20 obviously was particularly acute for credit. And Carl, you can probably address that a little bit. And specifically in the commodity space, where I spend a lot of my time and thought process, obviously the oil market, specifically WTI, flipping to a big negative, that did hurt some people, some service providers as well. Again, it's an exogenous variable. We may have to make, adjust codes to take into account negative pricing, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just saying is that you had to survive those two time periods in order to be even considered for an ODD of a tactical program.
Yeah, good answer. Raj, what's your thoughts on this?
Sure. From a COVID-19 perspective, very little change for us on an operational due diligence standpoint. We trade only U.S.-based futures through the CME and ICE. We had some trades that clearly worked out. We're having a good year. From a due diligence standpoint, I mean, we are both fully functional from home and the office. So the impact from that standpoint is very little. And we trade directionally both long and short. We got stopped out on a few trades several times, but ultimately got them to stick, and that's why our performance is where it's at.
So moving on, the sort of next question I have in mind is talking literally about errors, trade errors, particularly for these tactical guys. I think there were a lot of trade errors over this time. And the question is more a case of, were they trade errors or were they just bad trades disguised as trade errors? And as an analyst, how would I know?
Carl, I know you've always been keen on the trade error thing. What I would say is that today the concept of trade errors doesn't have anything to do with what it did 20 or 30 years ago. And consequently, this is why you find in manager reports or fund documentation, a passing reference to trade errors, but I've never seen a trade error appear on a fund income sheet, basically saying I received a credit of 10K, 100K, $1 million from a manager because of a trade error. It just doesn't happen. But today, what I would say is that to have a trade error that really is consequential would have to be either related to a service provider or border on some degree of incompetence somewhere that have to be identified. However, increasingly, even with a forensic sleuth like yourself on the case, it's going to be very hard to say, did Roger actually made a mistake when he shorted, 50 platinum, when he actually wanted to do it, $100 lower? I don't know, but he got in and got out. And I don't know if that was Roger's trade or not, but I'm just saying is that it's one of those things that you have to be very reflective about. And ultimately, it gets more to do with manager behavioral qualities rather than actual errors.